Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. As of May 2021, prices increased 5% over the course of 1 year, the sharpest increase in inflation since 2008. Inflation poses a palatable threat to the economic prosperity of America. Its prevalence is perpetuated by political institutions, corporations, and personal opinions. Big corporations and moguls will not necessarily suffer through significant change with the 5% increase in prices. The common citizen is more likely to be presented with financial hardships in their daily purchases. Peter Jacobsen, professor of economic education at Ottawa University, sits down with our director of communications, Eric Kohn, to discuss the problems inflation proposes to America's economic processes. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen.
Peter Jacobsen is the Eugene S. Thorpe Writing Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education. He's also an assistant professor of economics at Ottawa University and the Gwartney Professor of Economic Education and Research at the Gwartney Institute. He received his PhD in economics from George Mason University and obtained his BS from Southeast Missouri State University. His research interest is at the intersection of political economy, development economics, and population economics. Peter is the author of the recent piece published at fee.org, No, Higher Wages Aren't a Silver Lining of Inflation. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today on Acton Line.
Eric, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on.
So let's do a little table setting here first. We've heard the reports about inflation and what is happening now. How much inflation are we seeing? How bad is it actually? And put it in historical context for you if you can. Because for most people, even if they're not old enough to have experienced it, you hear inflation and you think back to the 1970s and the stagflation era. So how much inflation is happening? How long has it been happening? And historically speaking, how bad is it?
Sure. Well, again, thank you for having me on, Eric. There's, I guess, a little bit there. I think the best way to contextualize it is just recently, the CPI numbers came out for June. And the most recent numbers are that we're a little over 5% for inflation. So the price level has risen 5% year over year. And that's the highest rate in about 13 years. So we're looking about since 2008. And so we're not quite, to 70s levels yet of inflation. Prices haven't risen in the same way that they were during the stagflation period. But this is a significant sort of high watermark for the last, now over a decade. Not quite enough that it's harmful on a huge scale to the economy, but enough that like everyday people who kind of live month to month with their budget are going to be feeling it. You'll feel 5% higher prices at the grocery store. So that's kind of the context that I would put it in.
So people will feel it in those regular purchases. That's understandable. Where are the areas, other than grocery purchases, like you mentioned, where would people be most feeling the effects of inflation like this?
Sure. So another category that's jumped up a whole lot recently is things like used cars. And so, automotives are a category in general that's gone up, but specifically used cars, things bought secondhand. And you can see sort of this pattern that this tends to be or is tending to be sort of regressive inflation. And by regressive, I mean it's impacting, the poor people in society. And so used cars is another great example of, if you have a lot of money, you're probably not worried about buying a used car. But if you're living basically beater car to beater car and used cars are up, 100% or 200% or something like that, that makes a big difference. I think I saw, especially like used pickup trucks right now are several 100% over their normal price. So now it's not the time to buy it. But if you need it, if you're living with a car that's gone out, you're kind of in a bad spot right now.
So for used cars in particular, how much of that inflation that we're seeing there is being influenced? Because I know in the context of this conversation on inflation, we'll get to the government's role in all of it, all of the money that we've been spending and the impact that that's having on inflation. But specifically with that example, to what extent is the inflation we're seeing in used cars a subject of some of the peculiarities that are outgrowths from the COVID pandemic? That, I think I know there's an issue with microprocessors, and most cars now that are being created have computer systems within them because, or at least as I've heard it told, because of the limitation of that, and you can't churn out new cars as quickly. Old cars are then the default that people are going to go to. They're going to purchase used cars, and because of that, there's a rush on them, and thus the price is rising. Is that accurate to your knowledge, or are we just seeing more generalized inflation in the used car market?
Eric, I think certainly since the used car market is the outstanding example that there could be some of that. But what you should start to expect to see, if that's the case, is that inflation across the board should start to sort of come down. If this was just specific pandemic stuff rather than pandemic response, which, as you mentioned, we'll get into. But the pandemic level problems, what this does when prices of things like microprocessors go up, because of supply chain issues, or for example, rental car companies sold off a lot of their stock when the pandemic was going on because no one was renting cars, and so now they're buying that stock back up, and so of course that's going to increase the price of automobiles. So there's some of that, but we've been basically talking about when this first came up in April. People said, well, this is a blip because of last year's rates of inflation were very low in April. This year it's very high. And now you're hearing some kind of talk, well, this is just transitory, but the Federal Reserve actually is indicating that they don't expect this to fall anytime soon. And they've committed to continuing the policies that they're doing right now. The word transitory is used, but I'm not exactly sure what that means. I think at least a significant part of this, we're seeing it across most markets. Raw materials have increased, again, food, the used cars. There's not really a whole lot of things that are down in price right now. So I think there has to be some general amount going on, which does comport with, what we would expect in macroeconomics based on what's happened in the pandemic response.
So in the 1970s, what made that incident so bad was you had the combination of inflation along with high unemployment. Are we seeing, or are we on a trajectory for similarly bad unemployment numbers? I mean, I can point to certainly the anecdotal stories, right? So here in Grand Rapids, pretty much every time that I have gone out to dinner, I have seen a sign in the door that says, we're doing more with less. We have, we're understaffed at the moment. It's difficult to get people to accept jobs. I've seen, I think it was at an Applebee's, or it might have even been an Arby's, that they were offering basically a $200 signing bonus just for people to put in an application and accept an offer to work there. So are we seeing, or are we on a trajectory for similarly bad unemployment numbers that could put us into that stagflation problem like we saw in the 1970s?
Yeah, that's a good question, Eric. I think certainly we're on the way to possibly what I would call a higher natural rate of unemployment. And so the natural rate of unemployment, listeners can think of as basically your unemployment when times are good, when you don't have a recession. And this varies from country to country. So, for example, in Italy, something like 6% last time I looked is like the natural rate of unemployment, where in the U.S. it's closer to 2 to 3%. So that means in good times, Italy still has this unemployment rate of 6%. And, there's some debate over why this is, but one of the, obvious things you can point to is that Italy has very, generous unemployment benefits. And that's something that we're seeing as sort of part of the problem with getting people back to work right now, is people are, rationally responding and saying, well, why would I go back to work at a job that's going to give me just as much as the benefits that I'm getting? And so this is sort of a situation that's been created by our incentives. What could maybe draw us into worse levels of unemployment, though, and part of my fear is, if inflation continues and it continues in input markets, and so markets for wood and, steel and things like that, well, what that's doing is, the long-term projects that have been started, long-term investment projects, businesses had to make predictions about prices in those long-term projects. And if their predictions are way low, in other words, if they bet, the price of wood is going to be, we'll say, 1% higher next year and it's 5%, that could cause that project to go under. And so long term, if inflation continues, I do have some concern that unemployment will start to tick up as these projects fail. I think that's a possibility.
So we mentioned the Federal Reserve earlier. What is the Federal Reserve doing, or what would it be looking to do to try to stave off inflation or try to control it as best they possibly can?
Well, I think the most important thing they could do is stop doing what they are doing. And so when the coronavirus pandemic began, the Federal Reserve way ramped up policy, which leads to the printing of money. The institutional process of who actually prints new money is a little complicated, but at the end of the day, you can sort of understand it as the Federal Reserve at least is directing how much new money is being created. And I think money has risen within the last a little over a year. Something like the supply of money, the number of dollar bills floating around, has risen by 33% per Federal Reserve policy. And so the point of that was, when people are not buying a lot of stuff, if we put all this new money into the economy, well, that's going to convince businesses to take on investment projects. It's going to kick up buying and, save us from a recession. The problem is now people are going out and buying with that new money. Pandemic restrictions have been largely lifted on business. And so all that new money is floating in. That's leading to people, purchasing a lot more than they otherwise would because there's more money to purchase with. This is what the article talks about, is this increase in nominal wages. And so that's leading to some of the inflation that's going on. And so the first thing the Federal Reserve could do is basically stop engaging in this activist monetary policy of adding more and more money to the economy. And, maybe there's some sort of maybe requirement here to go to a more solid rule. Milton Friedman proposed something like a K% rule. You increase the supply 1% every year, 2% every year, 3% every year. But some sort of rule that limits how much the Fed can increase the money supply would be a good start to staving off inflation, I think.
How much is the activity of the Federal Reserve really of their own domain that they're deciding to engage in this policy? Is this in conjunction with all of the pandemic-related spending we've seen from Congress? Is it a direct follow-on from that? Is it just something running in parallel with it? How connected or unconnected are the two, the policy from the Fed that you just mentioned and the legislation in Congress that has spent trillions of dollars in the last 15, 16 months?
I think there's some amount of connection, and that's a question that will sort of bear out over time. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be independent from Congress. And so this is the idea, is that the Federal Reserve is basically a private corporation that Congress has given the reins to decide how much money is in the economy. And, it's supposed to not be dependent on political considerations. The idea being that we don't want someone controlling monetary policy for the purpose of getting reelected or something like that. We don't want basically a president controlling the Federal Reserve and using it for their own purposes. Unfortunately, I think in the past, we have direct evidence. And so, for example, in the Richard Nixon administration, we have recordings of him pressuring the Federal Reserve chair at the time to increase the money supply. But there's other instances more recently of the Federal Reserve employees having close relationships with people like Goldman Sachs. This was a big revelation of what were called the Carmen Segarra tapes, because that was the Federal Reserve employee who leaked them. And so I think that the Federal Reserve is more connected to political considerations than we would like to believe. And one of the tools that the Federal Reserve one thing they can do is they can monetize the debt. In other words, the Federal Reserve, one thing that it does is it creates money. And in that money creation process, what it's doing is it's creating the money and it's buying government debt with it. And so it sort of enables the process of debt creation. And so there is a direct link there. The political consideration should be independent, but I think, in fact, they tend not to be.
Let me take a little bit of a different route, because I've been meaning to do an entire podcast on this, the topic of this next question I want to ask you. But there is this growing I can't remember the first time I heard the term, but this growing movement of what is called modern monetary theory that suggests that, all of this debt that we're creating, what the Federal Reserve would be doing there and monetizing the debt, it doesn't really matter. Again, feel free to correct me on the theory of modern monetary theory if I say it wrong, that it doesn't matter because, in effect, we owe it to ourselves. Now, I've read enough economics that thought that James Buchanan had addressed this back in the day, but all things old seem to be new again. So correct me if I'm wrong on what the thrust of modern monetary theory is, and then how it may or may not connect to a lot of what we're seeing happen right now.
And Eric, I'll say it's kind of tricky to address modern monetary theory because it is very opaque. And in fact, some economists have argued intentionally so that it's difficult to get a grasp on exactly what's being said because it's made purposefully vague in order to have more difficulty talking about it. But part of this is that a lot of the modern monetary theory movement has avoided the traditional academic outlets. And so rather than peer-reviewed journals pushing it, there's a lot of published books on modern monetary theory. But you have the gist basically correct, that we can engage in this process of printing money. And this money printing and this debt creation is actually okay because, in the future, we're going to be more productive. And so we're able to pay that off. And in fact, if we spur employment of unemployed resources today, we're going to create more growth. And so this is kind of like a free lunch. This is what the modern monetary theory people say. Now, there are sort of two responses to this that I think are important. The first is that even modern monetary theory people in general will tend to acknowledge that the only thing that prohibits this from happening is the possibility of inflation. And I think that the arguments that they often make is that, we're nowhere near that point. We're not at the point where prices are going to rise, because even the modern monetary theory people recognize if you have an increase in the supply of money, it's very large. More people have money in their pockets. They're going to spend it more. That's going to lead to prices rising. It didn't take very long for that to happen, it appears. It looks like prices are already rising. This is maybe our first experiment in, financing a huge amount of spending. Not the first, I guess I shouldn't say, but the most recent experiment of financing a huge amount of spending with new money. And already we're seeing the inflation. And so I think even, a reasonable...
Conservative ideas are no longer welcome on most college campuses, or anywhere else for that matter. If you are a conservative college student or professor, then you already know what I am talking about. If you are hungry for great conservative ideas, look no further. Check out the Conservative Conversations with ISI podcast today. Presented by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, this podcast is a series of in-depth conversations with leading thinkers of the most important issues facing conservatism. Join Johnny Burtka and James Davenport and dig into the world of conservative ideas with thinkers like William F. Buckley Jr., Richard Weaver, Yuval Levin, Ross Douthat, and more. To listen, go to isi.org/podcasts or subscribe on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Don't let them keep you from conservative ideas. Listen today.
MMT believer, modern monetary theory, might acknowledge that this experiment is having some difficulties early on here. Maybe they'd say inflation's transitory, it's going to go away. But regardless, that's one part of the problem. The other part, and you mentioned Buchanan, that's a great point to bring up, is that we don't exactly owe the debt to ourselves. Really what's happening is the debt can is being kicked down the road. And so the people who are going to owe the debts to us is future generations. And so what we're doing essentially is we're consuming future wealth today. That leaves less for future generations. And so, if you wave your hand and obscure with aggregates, you could say, oh, the U.S. owes it to the U.S. But no, it's really individuals in the U.S. today who are taking money, and the individuals in the U.S. tomorrow are going to have to pay that money back. And so it's not exactly owing it to ourselves. That's a little bit of, I think, either naive or even maybe intellectually dishonest way of looking at things.
It strikes me that the way Congress and the way political actors are acting right now is, or at least they have been, is as if they don't have a fear of inflation. I think if you look at and examine the politics of of course, the 70s when stagflation was a thing, into the 80s and the 90s, we get into a period of the 90s where we, I know some people would contest this, but more or less had balanced the budget before things start going off the rails again. It seems that it's far enough in the rear view mirror that politicians are operating as if we don't have to be concerned about the problem of inflation. So to what extent might an experience like this be good, not in the sense of the impact, and we're going to get to your article in just a moment here, the impact that it is going to have on people. That is clearly bad. But perhaps to implant back into the minds of people that inflation is something we should be concerned about. And as Edmund Burke said, that example is the school of mankind, and he shall learn it no other. Perhaps we need to live through that example, hopefully as mild as possible, but to remind ourselves that inflation is something that we should be concerned about in policymaking.
I'd like to be optimistic on that angle, but I don't think I can be. And the reason why not is I don't think that the political institutions generate this sort of knowledge that you're talking about that in the future we'll remember. And I actually think that's why, despite the fact that a lot of people who lived through the 70s are currently alive today, why there's not too much concern. That is, a lot of people, at least in the short term here, can benefit from inflation. People in large corporations who are receiving stimulus check money from COVID, big corporate bailouts essentially, they're getting money, and that's coming from, on the other end, the inflation of people's purchasing power, people losing purchasing power. It's sort of like a tax on everyone, and the people who are able to avoid the tax are people who have access to basically financial instruments that let them avoid inflation, things that rise immediately with inflation. And so I actually think there's a lot of incentive for corporations to support politicians who are interested in inflationary policies. And now it could also be possible, at the end of the day, politicians are somewhat beholden to corporations, but there is like the majority rule sort of vote that happens. So maybe, the average voter or the median voter, we would say in economics, will also learn that inflation's bad and be wary of it. I think that's possible, but I'm just worried it's a little bit unlikely. And the reason is people have, lots of things to do in their lives, and they make lots of decisions that directly impact their lives. Voting is not something that you can make a decision about that's going to directly, positively or negatively influence your life, because it's unlikely that your vote's going to affect the outcome. And so because your vote's unlikely to affect the outcome, I don't think people have a big incentive to learn about, different political things like inflation, different political policies. Because it's very costly to learn about, but learning about them doesn't provide you much of an individual benefit because it requires everyone else to learn about it. So I'm a little hesitant to be optimistic because I think political institutions in general ignore the sort of knowledge that something like inflation is bad.
Let me ask this. I agree with you that it is unlikely that the median voter is going to probably learn much about how inflation actually happens. I doubt that they're going to read any Buchanan. I agree with you on that. But to what extent would living through and seeing the headlines about inflation increasing would at least result in the body politic saying to the people who are in Congress and representing them, whatever you're doing that's making this happen, stop?
Yeah, I think that is certainly a mechanism which can operate. I think that if enough people understand that inflation is hurting them, and there's really an anti-inflation message that can bring about anti-inflation candidates. That is sort of one side of the equation. There's one force that maybe leads us in the direction of less inflation. On the other hand, though, we have the special interests who are interested in donating money to politicians, and supporting in primary levels politicians who are eventually going to support policies which may hurt the ordinary person. And so there's sort of two forces at work here. And empirically, in the future, which one is going to come out on top is a tricky question. But other things held constant, I do believe that more people living through and experiencing inflation will lead to some sort of short-run realization that, hey, whatever this is, like you said, that's going on, we need it to stop.
Let's take a look at your article for the Foundation for Economic Education. You took a look in your piece at a recent piece published at CNBC that said the silver lining of inflation is higher salaries. As inflation takes hold, wages may increase too. So, Peter, I'll do my best John Stossel impression here. I thought higher wages were good.
Well, Eric, luckily, I was surprised, too, in a good way. A lot of people, when this article came out, recognized that it was a problem. It got on Twitter, as they say, sort of a bad ratio. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of people quote tweeting and not a lot of people liking, which usually indicates, hey, this article is probably not very good. A lot of people are maybe criticizing it. And so that's something nice. But one of my friends mentioned to me at Feed, Brad Palumbo, actually another writer, said, hey, maybe you should write an article on this, because even though a lot of people understand this is wrong, they might not understand why. For that very reason, higher wages sound like a good thing. But here's the problem. The reason wages might increase with inflation, in fact, they would tend to increase with inflation, a rise in the general price level means a rise in all prices, or a general rise in prices, if you took an average, which means we should expect the price of inputs, including in that, such as labor, to also rise. And so, you think, well, maybe that's good. Nominal prices are increasing. In other words, prices driven by money and real factors are increasing. And so that means higher wages. The problem is, as your wages are rising, the reason, in fact, that your wages are rising is that there are a bunch of shortages going on in the markets for goods. And because there are shortages going on, in other words, there's been an increase in demands and now the price is too low. Because there's a shortage, now companies are going to start increasing the prices of their goods. And so the prices of the goods are going to increase. And in fact, they're probably going to increase before your wages increase. And so it's true that having a higher nominal wage, everything else held constant, would be nice, but everything else isn't held constant. Your wage is rising, but also the price of everything you buy is rising. And if the price of everything you buy rises before your wage increases, or its raise is larger than your raise in wages, you actually come out of it poorer.
For inflation, what do you do to stop it? So you have, and if you can talk about this, the policy that was engaged in the early 80s, which was effective by Paul Volcker, that helped shock us out of the inflation spiral that we had been in. Clearly, there needs to be some sort of a policy to address this, or at least it would seem to me that there would need to be some kind of a policy change to address this, because we've discussed the way in which both Federal Reserve policy and legislation from Congress are feeding this. What do you need to do to stop that train?
Yeah, so you can think of this in several different ways. You can think of it sort of like in a short term, 1 year, a longer term 10-year, and an even longer term 100-year sort of time frame. The 1 year is kind of what I mentioned earlier, that the Federal Reserve would just need to stop increasing the supply of money so much, because it's that large increase in the supply of money that's fueling the large number of purchases right now that's leading to an increase in demand in general. And so cutting back on that easy money and allowing the interest rate in the market for loanable funds. And so when the Federal Reserve pumps money into the economy, that money goes into banks and are lent out as loanable funds. Well, when you increase the supply of loanable funds, assuming demand stays the same, that leads to a lower interest rate. And so a lot of times the Federal Reserve is explicitly trying to lower the interest rate, because if you lower the interest rate, more investment projects will happen. The price of investing goes down when the amount that you have to pay back in terms of interest also goes down. And so the Federal Reserve is trying to lower the interest rate, but allowing the interest rate to go to where the market decides, well, that would allow prices to sort of, ease back a little bit, or inflation to not be as high as it is. And it would be according to market forces rather than the increase in the supply of money. So that's the 1 year thing. A 10 and a 100-year solution. One big thing that we could do to prevent this would be, as I mentioned before, some sort of monetary rules, something that constrains the Federal Reserve in times of crisis from printing a lot of money to finance the debt. And so a lot of times Federal Reserve members might feel pressure from politicians in bad times to engage in what's called activist monetary policy. And that usually involves the printing of money. And so one way we could protect them from having to deal with that pressure is to set certain rules on the Federal Reserve that prohibit the amounts that they're allowed to print money. And so this would be maybe a 10-year way to fix it. And then finally, in a 100-year sense, I think some policies that have been proposed in Congress protecting things like alternative currencies could also be helpful. So a recent hot topic that everybody's been talking about is cryptocurrency. Not that recent, but it's kind of blown up more and more and has been on an upward cycle. One nice thing about cryptocurrency is it de-incentivizes things like devaluing your currency in order to print more of it and, basically move the money around. If people have an alternative currency they can go to, you don't get as much tax revenue raised by inflation. In other words, you can't collect as much what we call seigniorage by increasing the supply of money. If people quickly substitute away from your currency, people stop using it, you're not raising money by printing more of it. And so that sort of constrains or limits governments from going on these crazy printing sprees where they lead to hyperinflation. We've seen this a little bit, actually, in a much more extreme case in Venezuela, where people have started moving towards cryptocurrency. And that sort of constraint is nice because it exists outside of the government's ability to control it. But it still forces the government to sort of follow a reasonable policy. And so I think as we hear more and more about cryptocurrency in Congress, policies which protect the trading of cryptocurrency, don't allow for government interference in it, are extremely valuable in the long run for curbing inflation.
I'm glad you brought up cryptocurrency because that is something that is markedly different now than in previous instances where we've dealt with problems of inflation, that there is that kind of an alternative that people could potentially turn to. I know one of the other reasons why we've always felt that the United States was immune to some of the other fiscal policy or at least monetary policy related concerns that other countries would have is that the dollar is the reserve currency of the rest of the world. What would it take for the dollar to lose its position as that reserve currency and then probably subject the United States to some different rules for the way that it needs to govern itself from a monetary outlook?
Yeah, that's a tough question, and I could cheat and answer it very generally in a way that would be like factually true, but I'll try to give you maybe the best answer I can instead. So to start with, the general answer is if borrowers felt, especially international borrowers, but even domestic borrowers too, felt that in the future the U.S. weren't going to be able to pay back its debts, that's one thing that could trigger maybe people to believe that the dollar shouldn't be the reserve currency. And the reason is government can only pay its debts three ways. You can think of it. One way is through direct taxation, income tax, things like that. So that's one way you can get revenue. But as the economist Art Laffer taught us, there's a limit on that. Once you increase taxes past a certain rate, you actually start to lower tax revenue. That's called the Laffer curve. Now, maybe we're not at that rate yet. That's an open question, but there is some rates. And once we get past that rate, that way is prevented. That will no longer work. The other way is by borrowing. And if borrowers feel that the U.S. government is not going to be able to pay back its debt, they're not going to borrow from the U.S. government anymore. The only thing that's left then, the only other way government has to pay back its debts is through printing more money. In other words, the U.S. could print a bunch of money up and pay back the debts that way. The problem is, if you're printing a ton of money to pay back your debts, you're acknowledging that the value of your money is going to fall. So if other countries ever believed, or even again, domestic citizens believed the U.S. is not going to be able to pay back its debts, well, there's a big incentive then to switch over from reserve currencies, because that would mean hyperinflation would be down the road, because the U.S., in order to pay back the debts, they're either going to have to default or print a bunch of money. So that makes holding dollars basically a risky proposition. And so if the U.S., what the level is that borrowers are going to be afraid of is kind of tricky to predict. I could make a lot of money if I was correctly predicting things like that. But, if the U.S. continues to borrow and spend the way it is, at some point, the interest rate that we're paying on our debt is going to start to exceed the amount our GDP is growing. And if that happens, if we're basically generating more debt from interest every year than we are increasing our GDP through growth, that's something where, borrowers are really going to start worrying, is the U.S. going to be able to make good on, this 20-year bonds I have? So I would say if the U.S. continues down the road of these multi-trillion-dollar bailouts, I think we're on the road to being replaced as some sort of reserve currency. And
as I understand it, that it really only would take an increase in interest rates of a couple of points at most to really put the United States in a difficult position with what share of what share of money spent and what share of the federal budget every year would be eaten up by debt payments.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so there, we're now on our third round of multi-trillion-dollar spending packages that we don't have financed. Again, I think with what you just said in mind, I think it's possible we're relatively close. The market doesn't feel that way, obviously. Otherwise, markets would be moving already if people expected this to happen. But I'd say we're at a more likely spot now than we ever have been.
Peter, let's wrap it up here. So as you pointed out, this is a complicated topic, and you wouldn't expect most people to, know much about inflation and why it happens beyond what they read and see in the headlines of, inflation has been going up. They're seeing that. For the people who are listening to this podcast, what is the one thing that you would want them to know to be able to impart to, their friends, their family, people they talk to about the inflation situation that we're currently experiencing, and how serious, in your view, it is?
Definitely. Eric, I would say it's not the red alert time where you need to put all your dollars immediately into gold and silver. So that would be the first thing that I would say is, we're not built a bunker level of worry now. And so you don't need to go to sleep at night fearful about inflation.
And what point would we be at red alert level? Like, what would people need? What would we need to see to know that this is a truly deeply serious problem?
I think a really good indication would be the Federal Reserve using treasuries and their prices. You can sort of back out what the market expects inflation to be. So if inflation expectations start to rise to higher levels, I think right now, it depends on the time frame you're looking at, but they're anywhere from basically 2 to 4% right now, inflation expectations, according to the market. In other words, the people who have their money on the line are betting that inflation is going to be 2 to 4% over the next few years. Once that starts to trickle up to 5% and then get up to 10%, or if we're ever like something like 15%, that's the time where it is really started like time to worry, because what that reflects is the people who have their money on the line believe that inflation is going to be significantly higher. And so that's a good thing to follow. So I would say if I wanted people to know anything, it's, don't stay awake at night right now, but you should be aware that the simple lesson is when you increase the amount of anything out of nowhere, if suddenly gold rains down from the sky, gold would lose its value. And so when we print a bunch of money, when the Federal Reserve prints money to monetize the debt or to basically use printed dollars to finance the debt, that's going to decrease the value of your money. And you should be aware of alternative options for storing your wealth. You should be aware of instruments that allow you to store your wealth in accordance with inflation. And so things that allow you to get some sort of nominal return rather than real return. But also you should be aware of alternatives, things like cryptocurrency, things that hold their value over time, in case something like this did happen. So in a political perspective, you should be aware of, when politicians are pushing for easy money or, you're pushing for a lot of printing, this is going to be damaging in the long run. And then on a personal level, it's important to understand how to avoid inflation.
Peter Jacobsen is the Eugene S. Thorpe Writing Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, Assistant Professor of Economics at Ottawa University, and the Gwartney Professor of Economic Education and Research at the Gwartney Institute. Peter, thanks so much for joining us today on Act in Line.
Thank you again, Eric.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at actinline@acton.org. Until next week, for Act in Line, I'm Gabriel Jaja.